They say money changes people, but isn't it revealing their true nature? Looking at Michael in front of me, I couldn't help but think this.
With this much, I can quit my job and buy a house. That's it. I might even take Dad and Mom on that trip they've always wanted to go on.
It's the money I inherited from my father, yet Michael starts calculating expenses like his own. Moreover, he even includes plans for my in-laws, whom I deeply despise. This is what my father left for me. You have no right to decide how to use this money. It was a cry from my heart, but Michael just laughed it off and casually waved his hand.
Your money is all mine, you know. If you defy me, I'll divorce you.
That's typical of Michael. He thinks if he says this, I will obey. Speaking in a threatening tone, Michael left the house. Things have changed. It can't go on as it used to. While Michael was gone, I decided to start preparing something. My name is Rachel, and I'm 30 years old. Since graduating from a vocational school, I've been working at the reception desk of a private hospital. I married Michael 3 years ago. I met Michael at a friend's wedding. At first, I was taken aback by his somewhat forceful demeanor, but the comfort of him being a friend of a friend led to us dating. And from there, we progressed to marriage.
I'll make sure you're happy, all right?
Although the statement was a bit patronizing, I genuinely felt happy. Back then, I dreamed a blissful married life. However, I quickly woke up from that dream. Before we got married, Michael and I would often stay at my place over the weekends and hang out. Because of this, I never realized it. Never realized how much Michael loved his family home and how much his parents adored him. A daughter-in-law isn't a guest, you know. I've heard this line so many times that I feel like my ears could bleed. She would remind me of this every time I visited after getting married. It's not like I was lounging around or acting all high and mighty. After being pointed out by my mother-in-law, I tried to be even more careful. When I'd arrive at their place, I'd immediately put on an apron, asking her things like, "Is it okay if I carry this here?" or "Can I wipe the table?" It's more exhausting than work. She's never even made tea for me. Michael and his father would just look at me and laugh, saying,
She is still not up to the mark.
I was so fed up with the whole family. If it was just a few times a year, maybe I could endure it. But with Michael, it's every single week.
Before I married Rachel, I was living at home, so I prioritized spending weekends with Rachel. But now that I'm living with Rachel, I need to prioritize spending time with my parents on weekends.
Unfortunately, their family home and our apartment are only 10 minutes apart by car. So at its worst, he would visit them even on weekdays. And the apartment where Michael and I currently live was originally my place. We got permission from the landlord, but it's cramped for the two of us. Hey, shouldn't we look for a bigger apartment? I suggested this shortly after our marriage, but his response left me stunned.
It'll cost money. If we're going to do that, we might as well just live with my parents.
The thought of spending 365 days in that house made me feel nauseous. Not. Since then, I've never brought up the topic of moving with Michael. He seems to have sensed my discomfort around his mother, and he often scolded me for it.
Sure, my mom might be strict, but that's what mothers are like, right? Well, maybe you wouldn't know since you don't have a mother.
Whenever the topic of my parents came up, Michael always seemed condescending. I grew up in a single-parent household with my father. My mother passed away when I was very young, so I was raised by my father. Once, after he had a bit too much to drink, my father told me that he and my mother had essentially eloped. Because of this, we didn't have any relatives to rely on. Moreover, my father owned a business and was very busy. So, in reality, it was our housemaid who raised me. She was kind to me, but she was still a stranger. I couldn't truly open up or be pampered by her, and I've grown up that way.
It's a pity. If only Rachel's father had been a little better at managing his business.
Michael said this with a hint of delight. I didn't like discussing this topic, but for some reason Michael occasionally brought it up. It's about the time when my father's business went bankrupt. My father had to close down his company a few years ago. I don't know the details, but it probably went under due to financial difficulties. This happened right around the time I decided to get married. Concerned for my father, I offered, "Do you want to live with us?" I could foresee Michael opposing the idea, but I couldn't abandon my father. In the end, my father chose to live on his own.
Don't worry about me. Just think about your happiness.
But
Your happiness is what matters most to me. Oh, and by the way, congratulations on your wedding.
I can still vividly recall the gentle smile he gave me that day. I wish I could have shown him the face of his grandchild, but sadly, we weren't blessed with a child. About 2 years into our marriage, pressured by my mother-in-law, I decided to undergo medical examinations. As a result, it was found that I had no issues. That led me to think that Michael might be the one with a problem, so I suggested he get examined too. Every time I met my mother-in-law, she would say, "You're useless if you can't even give birth to a grandchild." It hurt me, but Michael adamantly refused.
Absolutely not. We're not dogs or cats. It's embarrassing to go through such tests.
I was practically forced by my mother-in-law to get examined. I had no veto power. Even so, Michael should have known that. Please, if there's no abnormality, it will be reassuring. If there is, then we can address it. I just want to know. The pressure from your mother is also intense. Michael shakes his head.
Huh? So you're saying that for your sake, feeling the pressure from my mother, I should undergo a test?
That's not what I meant. I was wondering if there's a solution.
Do you think there's a solution for such a blessing? You probably just can't stand my mother's nagging. That has nothing to do with me.
No matter how much I pleaded, Michael wouldn't agree to the test. He knew all about the pressure and nagging from my mother-in-law, yet he didn't offer any support. Even when I talked to him, he brushed it off, saying,
That has nothing to do with me.
Weekdays were filled with work and household chores. Weekends were spent at my in-laws' place. Such days continued, and I was completely worn out. I considered divorce, but I couldn't go through with it, thinking of my father. I couldn't betray him, who wished for my happiness and was pleased with my marriage. I couldn't divorce. Perhaps Michael picked up on that thought. One day Michael went to his parents' house alone and returned the next morning. It was rare for Michael to go to his parents' house by himself. It was more comfortable for me that way, but I felt a bit suspicious. A few days later, I happened to see a call from a girl on Michael's smartphone screen that he'd left on the table. Michael hurriedly hid it. Why the rush? Who's that?
No, it's just a friend.
A friend? It's 1 a.m. Who calls the opposite sex at this hour? Michael had a history of womanizing, and such incidents had happened before. When I confronted him, Michael responded with an irritated click of his tongue.
You're always nagging. If you have a problem, let's get a divorce.
It was wrong of me to show such obvious distress at that moment. Michael must have relished it. At first, it was just words, but eventually he started brandishing divorce papers. Ultimately, he filled out divorce papers at me.
If you don't want a divorce, do as I say.
I became powerless against the gleeful Michael. It was around that time my father suddenly passed away in an accident. I hadn't been able to do right by him. As I cried so hard it hurt, Michael looked at me with cold eyes.
You'll only look uglier if you cry,
he'd remark. My father and I had no other relatives. I inevitably took on the role of the chief mourner. Michael briefly attended the funeral but left before the cremation. After everything was over, I was in a daze for a while. Then an unfamiliar man visited me after the funeral. It turned out he was a lawyer commissioned by my father.
Your father appointed me regarding the inheritance.
Huh? Hearing that my father left something for me was heartening. However, I remembered my father's business had gone under a few years ago. Without much expectation, I listened. And then I was astounded. What? $1.3 billion?
Yes, although there will be deductions.
No, that can't be. What was handed to me was a handwritten letter from my father in his will. It stated that he left an inheritance of $1.3 billion to me. I was overwhelmed by the staggering amount. According to the lawyer, I believed my father's company had gone bankrupt due to financial difficulties, but he had deliberately sold it. This became the staggering amount of $1.3 billion, which was now about to be entrusted to me. I understand, but Just for being his daughter, was it right for me to inherit such a huge amount? As I hesitated, the lawyer smiled gently.
I have had a long relationship with Mr. Rachel. He always wished for your happiness, Rachel. I understand it might be overwhelming, but having money isn't a burden. Perhaps consider it as your father's sentiments and accept it?
But
I'll handle the inheritance procedures and tax matters for you.
I glanced again at my father's letter and nodded. If it was something my father left for my happiness, I wanted to graciously accept it. Thank you. Please, take care of it. And so I unexpectedly came into a large sum of money. However, I couldn't just squander it. I didn't even want to touch it. I decided to securely store it, and if I truly faced dire circumstances, I would use it. For me, it became like a protective charm. I didn't tell anyone about the inheritance, and a few days passed. When I came home from work, as usual, I was stunned by the sight before me. What? On the living room table, my bank books, which I had kept hidden, were laid out, and guarding them, staring back at me, was Michael. What are you doing, taking out my bank books without asking? When I tried to grab the bank books, Michael swiftly hit them close to his chest, grinning maliciously.
What were you doing? Hiding this much money from me?
That is...
Did you do something illegal to get it?
Fuming at Michael's insinuations, I retorted. No, that's the inheritance my father left me. I tried to retrieve the bank books from Michael, but he tucked them into his clothes, refusing to let go. Give it back. Give it back to me.
I thought he was a worthless CEO who ruined his company, but who would have thought he'd leave such a parting gift?
Laughing, Michael got up and shoved me, causing me to fall. He then looked down at me with a smirk.
And don't worry, I'll give the bank books back, after I've checked everything.
While flipping through the bank books and humming to himself, Michael finally tossed them back at me.
$2 billion in total. Huh.
There was more, just in case I had spread it across new accounts. Michael, unaware of this, was looking satisfied.
With this much, I can quit my job and buy a house. Oh, I'll even take my parents on that trip they've always wanted.
Though it was money I had inherited, Michael was acting as if it was all his, and he even included his parents, whom I deeply disliked. Don't make decisions on your own. This money came from the company my father worked hard to build and then sold. It wasn't Michael's to use as he pleased. This is what my father left for me. You have no right to dictate how it should be used. It was a desperate plea from my heart, but Michael snickered, waving his hand dismissively.
All your money is mine, and if you defy me, remember, divorce.
He emphasized the word divorce and threatened me before leaving the house. From that day, Michael never returned. He was likely staying with his parents, as usual. They must be celebrating more than ever. Knowing Michael and his parents, they certainly would be. Sweat began to form on Michael's forehead.
What are you talking about, Rachel?
Michael's eyes darted anxiously from left to right. If I defied you, you said we'd divorce, right? I couldn't agree with your opinion at all, so I went ahead and got our divorce quickly.
Just like that, I never agreed to this. It's a forgery.
There's no need for forgery. I took out several completed divorce papers from my bag and tossed them in the air. They fluttered down to the floor. See? Look at all these divorce papers you gave me. Every time I had an opinion, you kept saying divorce, divorce, right? And each time you handed me a completed divorce paper. How many times had I given in to this man, taking his threats of divorce seriously? You probably thought that just by mentioning divorce, I'd obey you, didn't you? Michael swallowed hard.
Yes, that's right. That's because you didn't want to divorce me, right? Isn't that why you're doing this now?
Michael's voice sounded pitiful. You thought that because I didn't want to divorce you, I'd do as you say? With his eyebrows furrowed, Michael nodded.
Because you love me, right? You want to be with me, don't you?
I let out a sigh at his gross misunderstanding. I did marry him because I loved him, but just because I loved him enough to marry doesn't mean that feeling lasts forever. After all his selfish behavior, how could he not realize that? Such vanity. Sorry, but I don't love you at all anymore. I haven't loved you for quite a while now.
That's... A lie.
The only reason I hadn't divorced him was because I didn't want to worry my father. I wanted him to believe I was happily married. In retrospect, my father might have known all along. Now that my father has passed away, there's no reason for me to continue this marriage with you.
Is that why you moved out of this apartment?
I nodded slightly. Michael fell to his knees, shoulders slumped. His mother-in-law rushed over to him immediately. To abandon your loving husband the moment money comes in? You're the worst. Father-in-law, with his hand on Michael's shoulder, glared at me.
Exactly. How could you make kind Michael look like this? You should pay him compensation for this. You money grubber.
Compensation? I might have the right to receive it, but I don't have the duty to pay it. What did you say? After all, I've done nothing wrong. Unlike Michael, who's been having affairs left and right, I've never cheated. Michael's face turned pale instantly. Your childhood friend, your coworker, and was it Sarah from the bar? As I counted on my fingers, Michael's face grew paler. The mother-in-law standing next to him looked away awkwardly. That's different. That's... The mother-in-law stammered. Judging by this, it seemed likely the in-laws either knew about Michael's affairs or had been helping him. It must have been hard for you, aiding in Michael's alibis all this time. But don't worry, the cameras and voice recorders I installed in his car and bag did a great job. I have solid evidence. I gave a cheerful okay sign, and all three of them looked like it was the end of the world.
Please, I'll accept the divorce. Just not the compensation, please.
Exactly. Rachel, you have so much money now. Don't make Michael suffer unnecessarily. Is that the first thing they think of, even before apologizing? I sighed deeply. That money and Michael's affairs are unrelated. That was left to me by my father. Whatever Michael will pay me now is compensation for the pain he's caused me. They're entirely different matters. Of course, I plan to demand compensation from him. Once I do, everyone will know about it. When I demand it from his childhood friend, it will spread among Michael's friends. Superiors, colleagues, and even vaguely familiar clients might hear the rumors at his workplace. While the bar might not suffer much, he would probably lose his regular spot. I doubt Michael could continue living as he has been.
Rachel, wait, listen to me. Give me another chance.
Michael was tearful, trembling uncontrollably. Another chance? This is my chance. I can finally get away from you and your parents. 3 years of marriage. I wonder if Michael realizes how much pain I've endured.
Actually, the car and the trip, I got carried away that day and signed the contracts. I might be able to cancel the trip, but the car? It's from a place I've relied on for years. I can't possibly turn them down now.
He probably wants to say he can't pay the compensation because he wants to pay for those. That's none of my concern. I repeated my oft-heard line and put on my shoes.
Wait, Rachel!
I'll leave the compensation matter to my lawyer. This will be the last time I see any of you. Honestly, I don't feel the slightest bit of sadness. Just make sure to clean up the mess when you leave. You have your parents with you, so you'll be fine. Goodbye. I waved nonchalantly, quickly closed the door, and got into my car. Just as I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Michael chasing after me from the entrance, but I sped up anyway. Soon, Michael was out of sight. Later on, my lawyer told me that my former in-laws were quite resistant. Even though he was my lawyer, they complained to him. Just one affair. If you're divorcing, you should just let it go. And yet you're even demanding compensation.
Exactly. It's just a minor thing. You should just laugh it off. Rachel, you're so narrow-minded.
My lawyer replied.
It wasn't just one affair. There were 3 affairs. And given the duration, it can't be considered minor. It's a highly malicious case.
Only then did they fall silent. Honestly, I was astounded that Michael, a grown man, brought his parents for the negotiations. My lawyer commented.
With that, I doubt he'll ever remarry.
Chuckling. As expected, word of Michael's affairs spread, and his life changed drastically. He couldn't handle the stares, so he quit his job. Married friends started avoiding him, and without money, he stopped going out for drinks. It seems he's now just holed up in his parents' house. As for me, I moved to a far-off province because of the divorce. It's where my father grew up. I wasn't searching for my grandparents. I simply wanted to experience life in the place where my father grew up. It's a town that's neither too urban nor too rural. I'm currently working part-time at a local supermarket. I haven't touched my father's inheritance yet. I was tempted several times, but always reminded myself and Michael and his family to resist. Once I start spending the money, it's over. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm happy now. When I meet my father someday, I want to say with no lies, I'm happy. From now on, I want to live honestly.